Hey there everyone, this is Vintage Sewing Machine Garage, and today I am making a video for you on the topic of bobbins. Yes, I am making a video to talk about bobbins that will apply to any of the vintage sewing machines that you folks have or are thinking of getting. Now, in the vintage sewing machine world, there are a number of different bobbin types and sizes. The ones that I'm showing you here, are the most common. Now, there are a few that vary. Some of the Viking Husqvarna machines, some of the Bernina machines, and some of the German Pfaff machines, they use slightly different bobbins, but the vast majority of you who have vintage sewing machines, and I'm going to be making another video in the future to talk just about to address exactly what qualifies as vintage from my perspective. But for today, I wanted to talk to you folks about bobbins, and it may not seem like a very important topic, but I get tons of questions from people. And some of you, after seeing this video, it may be useful to you because it might help do some of the troubleshooting that you might have to do sometimes if your machine is not behaving properly. So the first thing I need to point out here is that for several of these bobbin types, probably the two most common that you folks are going to see are the Class 66 bobbins. Some of you call these the drop-in style bobbins. These are the bobbins that you literally put into the bobbin case, which is horizontal, and then you, once you've wound the bobbin beforehand, you put it in the bobbin case, and then you are going to thread that bobbin and get it ready in the machine for sewing. The other most common type you will see are the Class 15. Both of these were created by Singer, and they became, in many ways, almost universal standards. Many sewing machine manufacturers mimicked this and used this bobbin, and it's not a surprise that companies would follow Singer in certain things because Singer was the biggest manufacturer. They were a global massive company at one time, and so that's not a surprise. The other thing that is not a surprise is that you will often find new versions of these bobbins, and you might see them made in metal or you might see them made in plastic. Now, some of the more modern machines, even sewing machines made today, a number of them do use either the 15 class or the 66 class bobbins, and those machines might call for plastic bobbins, and that might be fine. But for all of us who are focused on vintage sewing machines, I want to cover some things that might help clear up some confusion and just a lot of questions that I get constantly about bobbins and which bobbins to use and which ones cause problems and so forth. So the first thing to say is that in a vintage sewing machine, never use plastic bobbins. Now, I know that some people have, and some people have apparently done so with no problems, but I never recommend doing that. One of the things that you often hear me talk about is with vintage sewing machines, one of the most important things that a vintage sewing machine does is that it creates tension on the thread on both the upper thread as well as the bobbin thread. Now, tension is determined by many things, and that's really a different video to talk about thread tensioning. I keep coming up with all these videos I'm now promising to make, but suffice it to say that the reason plastic bobbins can create problems is because they weigh less. Now, I know if you put a plastic bobbin next to this metal bobbin, we're not talking pounds here. We're talking fractions of ounces. But when you're dealing with vintage sewing machines, they are very specific about how their thread tension was engineered to occur. And part of what helps create tension on the bobbin thread is actually the actual weight of the bobbin in the bobbin case. It is part of a formula for getting thread tension correct. So if you put a plastic bobbin in a machine that was not created for it, you might get away with it, but you might not, and it may create tension issues for you, and I really don't recommend it, especially when vintage metal bobbins are not difficult to find. They are very plentiful. They were made in the millions, and they're not expensive. So I'm going to show you basically 4 different types of bobbins and what I recommend how I recommend you shop for them depending on the one that you need. So over here on the left is a bobbin that is specific to 2 machines. There may be a few European machines that used it, but this is the featherweight bobbin. This was designed for the Singer featherweight, or the 221 Singer as it is also referred to as. And it is also the bobbin that you must use for the Singer 301, or the 301A as it is often labeled. Now, what you're looking at here are metal bobbins. I have a vintage Singer weight metal bobbin right here, and then I have a newer metal bobbin that is marketed and sold for the featherweight and the 301. Now, the first thing I mentioned to you folks is be sure to use metal bobbins in your vintage sewing machines. The other thing I'm going to emphasize or highly recommend to you all is that you use vintage metal bobbins. And there is a reason for that. If you look at all of these different bobbins here, these are again the Singer 66 class, the drop-in style bobbins. Here you see a vintage metal, and here one of the newer metal bobbins. Here is Singer class 15, and with these bobbins, sometimes they will appear just like the drop-in. Sometimes you will see a solid bobbin with a small hole for threading, and you will sometimes also see that with the Singer 15 class, but you can also see vintage Singer 15 class bobbins with many holes, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with those at all. And the same holds true for, here's another Singer vintage 66 bobbin, and as you can see here, it has multiple holes, but this is a good quality vintage bobbin. Let's put that one next to this one. I don't want to confuse you guys with the solid versus holes. That's not the issue you have when you're trying to ascertain the difference between a vintage metal and a new metal bobbin. And there's a reason you should use the vintage ones. I highly suggest that you do so. Up here with the 15 class, this is one of the newer Singer 15 class metal bobbins. Over here are bobbins you don't see often. These are the bobbins that go in the old rotary machines, the ones that many of you have been asking me to do videos on, and I'm still working on getting videos made for the white rotaries, the Kenmore rotaries, and so forth. Now, these bobbins hold a pretty good amount of thread. If you look at them, the Singer 66 drop-in, I think they hold a good amount, but they are probably the least amount of thread capacity. But I still love them because there's a wonderful luxury of being able to drop the bobbin in and not have to take the bobbin case out each time you need to reload a new bobbin full of thread. Next would be, of course, the Singer featherweight bobbin. It holds a little more than the 66. I'll have to go back and check to see where the rotaries fit. I suspect the rotaries are going to be somewhat similar. Maybe they hold a little more than the featherweight bobbin. But the Singer 15 class are known to be the highest in thread capacity, in part because they are wider, not quite as big around, but they're certainly wider than the other bobbin styles. Now, let's zero in on why I am very adamant when people get sewing machines from me that I've restored. I think I mentioned you guys earlier in one of my longer videos when I was talking about parts, vintage parts. I always keep vintage bobbins, and I keep a supply so that my future customers I can at least give them a few starter vintage bobbins to get them going. So in the case of, and I don't know if this will show up on camera, but I'm going to hold up for you guys. One of these is a vintage, on the left is a vintage Singer featherweight bobbin, and on the right is one of the newer ones. Now the one on the right has a lip on it. It is one of the modern Singer weight bobbins. It has a little metal lip, and it has to do with how these were manufactured. The vintage featherweight bobbins are very smooth here, right? They're very smooth. The way these bobbins were made in the past is that they were machined. Newer metal bobbins, which are made overseas, are made more cheaply, and they use a different manufacturing technique. Now, other bobbin styles can have this little ridge that you sometimes feel, and it'll be okay. However, with featherweight bobbins, you can create issues for your featherweight or your 301 if you do not use the vintage style featherweight bobbins. So I really suggest that you do that. Now, the same thing can happen with the Singer Class 56 or the drop-in bobbins. So they should be very smooth. Now, when you're looking at them, let's say you don't have a solid bobbin. Let's say you have a vintage with the multiple holes in the sides and a newer one. And you guys are not going to be able to pick this up on camera, but you can do this by feel. If you're ever, let's say you get a machine and there's a bunch of bobbins in there, and who knows how new or old they are. You're looking at them, they look the same. What you can do is you can take and rub your thumb or your finger over the center of the bobbin. It should feel smooth to the touch, okay? On this one on the right, I know it was manufactured later and more cheaply because it feels a little rough, okay? It's not like super sharp, but it's snagging on my skin. And that snagging should be a clear signal to you that, yes, you might get away with using this in any of your vintage sewing machines, but really, folks, it's just not worth taking the chance. It really isn't. And so if it works for you, that's fine. But again, I have seen a number of people solve problems by going back to vintage bobbins. I know it sounds a little overly detailed to say, but vintage bobbins, just like vintage feet and accessories, they were made to the same quality as the old machines were. And very often the specifications for these bobbins were tightly controlled by manufacturers. They were very picky about the parts. Singer may have made their own bobbins. I'll have to double check. Excuse me. A lot of their attachments were made either in-house or by the greased company, but they were very high quality products. And the later metal bobbins, you can see just about everything else that's manufactured for consumer use, they started to cheapen the construction over the years. And again, this is very hard. Not only can I not really pick this up on camera, here's the vintage bobbin. I can hold up the newer one here that I know is not going to work well in a vintage machine. And it's very difficult, if impossible, to see, but you can feel it. Okay, and that's when you have them and you're looking at them, you say, God, they sure look the same. Touch them and see how they feel. They should feel smooth. They should not feel, if it in any way feels rough or coarse, that's a hint that you're not dealing with a vintage higher quality. The same is true for vintage Singer 15 class. So again, it's okay if it's solid or has holes in the sides. That's not an indicator of whether it's high quality vintage or not. So again, now the Singer 15 class, they have a ridge. But when I rub my fingers across the top, I feel the ridge, but it's nice and smooth. And the same is true for this other vintage bobbin, which has lots of holes in the side here. But you can go to any sewing shop today and you can get plastic or metal versions of Singer 15 class bobbins. And you'll look at them and they'll be nice and shiny and you think, oh, they're metal bobbins, they must be great and they're brand new. But if you start rubbing your finger, this one here, I can tell it was not machined and polished like it should have been or would have been in the old days. Okay? These bobbins new in a store today, they don't cost much, and there's a reason for that. If they don't cost a lot, one of the reasons is the quality. So again, I'm curious, to those of you who've been able to do this with your machine, you may have had a different experience, okay? But my experience tells me to steer clear of new metal bobbins. Let's see, and the same is true over here. Even with the rotary bobbin, this is the vintage one. This came out of the white rotary that I recently picked up, and we'll be hopefully getting some videos for you guys soon. And it also has a little ridge, but it's very smooth. You can tell that it was machined with great quality. And this new, I'm rubbing this and it's rough. You guys cannot see this. It's not going to pick up on camera, and it's even difficult to see with the naked eye. You really have to, let's see if it'll focus in. It's almost impossible to see, but when you touch it, you move your finger around the inner rim there, and it won't feel smooth like the old one. It feels rough. That's the giveaway. Now, a couple of other things to mention about bobbins to you folks. I'm going to do a troubleshooting video when I talk about the common things that can go wrong with the vintage sewing machine and how you can kind of use that as sort of a quick, short checklist to hopefully get you running again. Vintage machines almost never break. Okay, one of those things, and I'll mention this again in the troubleshooting video, guys. But one of them has to do with what kind of condition your bobbin is in. Now, bobbins typically don't really wear out unless they've gotten oxidized or rusted, but they can be damaged. So I was restoring a machine one time, and I'd gone through the whole machine, and it was just not sewing properly. It would sew a stitch, and then intermittently it would sew properly, and then it would start messing up the stitching. And what I discovered is it ran out of thread. So I went to wind the bobbin, and many of your vintage machine have bobbin winders where the bobbin is vertical. Okay, so it sits up on a mount, and then you hook it up, and when you start running the motor to wind the bobbin will spin. Okay, and if you get right in front of your bobbin and look at it, it should stay true. It should look like it does here in my hand, only it's spinning. If it starts to wobble while you're spinning and winding it on the bobbin winder, that is a clue to you that that bobbin is warped. Now, normally, the old bobbins the quality was high. What often happens is, people over time, they sometimes will drop bobbins on the floor. Sometimes somebody will step on it or sit on a bobbin. I mean, they're small pieces of steel, and sometimes they'll get slightly bent and they'll still run, but at some point the bobbin can get warped, and if it does, check it. And it's an easy way to check the bobbin. Even if you don't need to wind it, you can set up your bobbin winder. You don't even have to put thread on it. Just put it on the bobbin winder, have it start spinning, and take a look at it. And if it starts to wobble, you know that the bobbin is warped. Replace it and see if that solves your problem. So that is kind of a short primer, if you will, guys, on bobbins. You would think that, okay, it's a bobbin, what's the big deal, right? Because a bobbin is nothing but a metal spool for thread that goes in the machine and provides your bottom sewing thread. But it's kind of sad that not only are new machines today not made the way the old ones were, neither are the bobbins. And if you say, okay, I've got an all metal machine, it's a vintage machine, I don't want plastic, which is good, I want metal, which is great, that's not enough. So where can you get vintage metal bobbins? You can get them many places. You can go to places like eBay, bonanza.com, where I get a lot of my used parts. You can go to Etsy, lots of places, but be sure that the seller is specifying that they are vintage, and you may even want to ask them, can you tell me roughly, not the exact year, can you tell me roughly what, how old you think these bobbins are, right? And if you get them and they feel smooth to you and they run smoothly, then you have succeeded. And once you have enough bobbins, guys, you take care of them. There's really not a whole lot you need to do to them. If you have a bobbin, I cannot speak today. If you have a bobbin like this one, for example, this one has on the very top a little bit of oxidation. Hard to tell why. It may have sat in the machine and been exposed to moisture. If the oxidation is just surface, very light, you can take and polish that off. and then you can take a little sewing machine oil and buff it. I don't mean drench it. You don't want a bunch of sewing oil in your bobbin case. That's the last thing you want. But you can take a little metal polish, buff it off, make sure you remove all that polish with alcohol, and then just take with your finger one little drop of sewing oil and rub it over the bobbin and then buff it with a cloth. That light layer of oil will protect the metal, and you can easily salvage old bobbins this way, okay? As long as they're not heavily pitted, that's not a bad idea. But again, whether you have a solid, whether you have a solid vintage bobbin or one with holes, that's not so much the issue. You want to make sure that that center part of the bobbin, whether it has a ridge, and it's supposed to, such as the Singer 15 class, but it's a nice smooth ridge, right? It's okay to run your finger around it and it doesn't feel rough. Or if you have a Singer featherweight bobbin and you really are not really wanting to see much of any ridge on those. But again, just a little hint for you guys, if you're ever looking at bobbins and thinking, what's the big deal? Well, they actually are a big deal. Remember, sewing machines are designed to work with certain specifications, and as long as you set the machine up with how it was designed for setup, it should sew really well for you. So anyway, guys, thanks for watching. I'm going to try to come up with a few more videos here, not always 30 minutes, 39 minutes long. But this is a topic that I get a lot of questions about. I rarely see, I don't know if I've seen videos on it, maybe you have. If any of you have comments or further questions, let me know. Let me know what you think. Hopefully, even though this is a video about vintage sewing machine bobbins, I'm hoping this was helpful for some of you. And anyway, I appreciate you watching, and I'll look for your comments below. Thank you.